They laughed in my face before the smell of grilled meat had even faded into the evening air. And 5 weeks later, those same people were standing at my front door, shoes soaked through, asking for an explanation. The Willow Creek barbecue was bigger than usual that year. Long tables covered in red and white checkered cloth stretched across the lawn, smoke from sizzling steaks curling into the scent of freshly cut grass. Country music drifted through the air, blending with the clink of glasses and polite, social laughter. On the surface, it looked like a perfect picture of community spirit, the kind the HOA board loved to showcase in their HOA stories in the neighborhood newsletter. I stood at the edge of the grass, a glass of iced tea in my hand, observing the way I always did, like a man who measures the current before stepping into the water. Behind me, not far away, my 3-foot flood wall rested quietly under the fading sunset. Reinforced concrete core, natural stone facing, a French drain system running beneath it like silent veins. Total cost, $12,000. Every dollar saved from 30 years of working with water, pressure, and topographic maps. "Garrett," Karen called out, her voice drawn out as if she were introducing the evening's entertainment. "When are you taking down that ugly wall?" The group around her burst into laughter. The wine glass in her hand caught the light. Her eyes swept over me, then over the wall, as if it were a stain on the white dress of the neighborhood. "Prison yard chic isn't really our aesthetic," Bell, head of the architectural committee, chimed in. "It lowers property value." I did not respond right away. I was used to this kind of Karen story. The quiet man labeled outdated, stubborn, maybe a little eccentric. They saw my gray hair. They saw my old pickup truck. They did not see the years I spent standing in the rain, reading elevation maps, calculating discharge rates in the middle of the night. "That wall has a full permit," I said slowly. "County approved. Drainage study attached." Karen shrugged. "The HOA has discretionary authority. We can vote to require removal." The word authority in her mouth sounded like a small hammer tapping against a swelling ego. A few people nodded. A few shifted uncomfortably. But no one stood with me. They did not know. 2 years earlier, water from the creek behind our neighborhood had crept into my garage, only about 2 inches high, but enough to leave my wife sitting curled up in the living room, eyes wide with panic, as if she were hearing the sirens of an old storm all over again. She had developed anxiety after the previous flood, and I had sworn the water would never touch our doorstep again. I did not build that wall for aesthetics. I built it because I understand water. Water does not care what the HOA thinks. Water does not read newsletters. Water follows slope. So, Karen raised her glass and turned to the crowd. "All in favor of issuing a removal demand?" Hands went up, hesitant at first, then firm. 4 out of 5 board members. The decision passed between scattered applause and the faint smell of overcooked meat. In that moment, I could see exactly what each of them was thinking. Karen believed she was protecting the image of the neighborhood. Belle was thinking about summer brochures. Winston, whose house sat closest to the creek, feared only one thing: the water returning to its old path. 30 days, Karen said, looking straight at me. "Or fines begin. 30 days. I nodded lightly, as if I were listening to a weather forecast. But when I turned and walked back toward my house, a thought began to take shape, slow, heavy, solid as the concrete beneath that wall. I remembered the elevation maps I had studied at the county office. I remembered the decorative berm the HOA had installed the year before to enhance curb appeal. Without realizing it, they had altered the natural flow of water, pushing pressure toward the center of the neighborhood. They thought my wall was the problem. They did not understand it was only a response. The evening wind picked up. The air grew thick with moisture. I looked toward the creek. The surface was calm, but darker than usual. In the distance, black clouds gathered into a long, stretching line. A storm was forming out there. Not only in the sky. I stepped inside, opened the drawer of my desk. Inside were copies of my permit, my flow calculations, and a small recording device I had placed on the HOA meeting table the month before. One-party consent state. Completely legal. They saw a stubborn old man with an ugly wall. They did not see a man who had spent his life reading the language of water. 30 days, Karen had said. I let out a slow breath, listening to the wind whistle through the doorframe. Water does not need 30 days. And when it rises, even just 6 inches, every laugh from that summer evening will sink very quickly. The removal demand was sent by certified mail, as if I were a threat to the entire neighborhood. They did not know I had been sitting in the county office before they even managed to hold their first meeting. 3 days after the barbecue, a white envelope lay on the carpet in front of my door. The red HOA stamp was pressed across the top right corner, the words "violation of regulations" printed in bold, like a sentence handed down. I picked it up, feeling the thickness and stiffness of the paper, exactly like the way they were trying to appear firm. Inside was the official notice: 30 days to remove unauthorized structure. If not, fines would begin, a new charge each week. The language was cold, detached, as if my wall were an act of rebellion instead of an engineering solution. My wife sat at the dining table, her hand gripping the edge of her coffee cup. I caught the flicker of worry in her eyes. She was not afraid of the fines. She was afraid of the confrontation, afraid of the looks behind our backs, afraid of feeling isolated in the very community where we had lived for more than 15 years. "Maybe we should just take it down," she said softly. Her voice was small, but heavy with pressure. I shook my head, not out of stubbornness, but because I knew what they did not. A week before laying the first stone of that wall, I had gone to the county engineering office. I brought elevation maps, photos of past floods, and my own hand-drawn plans. I did not talk much. I simply laid everything on the table. The young engineer flipped through the file, then looked at me. "Did you work in this field?" I smiled slightly. 30 years. Army Corps." Her expression changed immediately. No more polite sympathy for an old man afraid of rainwater. It was recognition. She turned each page carefully, checking every number: slope gradient, soil absorption rate, projected rainfall over the 10-year average. "This design is not only compliant," she said. "It actually addresses the problem that neighborhood is facing." I submitted the permit application. 2 weeks later, the approved stamp came down, clear and unquestionable. But the HOA had never asked whether I had a permit. They only saw the surface. That night, I opened my laptop and read the Willow Creek bylaws carefully. The section on architectural control stretched nearly 5 pages. But there was one line they had overlooked: "Any structure compliant with county safety and flood regulations shall not be unreasonably denied." Unreasonably. That word felt like a small crack in the wall of their authority. The board meeting took place on Tuesday evening. I arrived 10 minutes early, slipping a small recording device into my jacket pocket. One-party consent state. Legal. Clear. Karen sat at the head of the table, a stack of documents in front of her and a red pencil resting on top. She looked at me the way a principal looks at a student about to be disciplined. "Mr. Garrett refuses to comply," she began, her voice sharp as a blade. "The wall disrupts community harmony." Harmony. I almost laughed. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and placed a copy of the permit on the table. The county stamp caught the fluorescent light. "This structure was approved under floodplain regulations," I said slowly. "Under Section 8.2 of the bylaws, the HOA cannot deny a structure that meets safety standards." Karen blinked. Clearly, she had not read that far. Belle lowered her head, flipping through the documents. Winston frowned. "The HOA has discretionary authority," Karen repeated, but this time her voice was less certain. "Authority does not mean overreach," I replied. The air in the room thickened. I could see the irritation on their faces. They were used to residents lowering their heads at warning letters. They were not used to being challenged with the very rules they had written. Karen leaned forward. "Are you threatening the board?" I shook my head. "I am simply repeating the law." A long silence followed. I could hear the low hum of the air conditioner above us. I looked at each board member in turn. They no longer saw a lonely old man. They were beginning to see something else. A man who understood the system. A man who did not speak often, but knew exactly where he stood. The meeting ended without a final decision. They said they would review the matter. But I knew they would not step back easily. Their egos were larger than my wall. As I stepped out of the room, Winston hurried after me. "Do you really believe that wall is necessary?" I looked toward the creek in the darkness. The surface was calm, but in the distance the sky was already heavy with clouds. "I do not believe," I said. "I know." He fell silent. On the drive home, I could feel the shift. They had mocked me at the barbecue. They had sent the warning letter. But now, they were beginning to doubt themselves. And that was only the beginning. They thought this was a Karen story about an old man defying the HOA. They did not understand that this was never about aesthetics. It was about physics. And physics never takes a vote. The weather report that night did not talk about if. It talked about when. And when the water begins to rise, it will not ask whether the HOA agrees. 3 days after the tense meeting, I stood behind my house, watching the creek move quietly past. The surface was darker than usual, the current slow but heavy. Above, black clouds folded into thick layers, like an army lining up along the horizon. My phone vibrated. A notification from the National Weather Service. Heavy rainfall expected over the next several days. Soil saturation already at elevated levels. I read each line carefully, not out of fear. Out of habit. Water is never the enemy. It simply does what it is meant to do. Meanwhile, the HOA group online was busy in a different way. Karen posted a long message, her tone both warning and mocking. Reminder: unauthorized structures must be removed to maintain community standards. Below it, a few supportive comments. Some people stayed silent, reading without daring to say anything. I knew what they were thinking. They thought I was stubborn, stuck in the past, the type who insists on doing things his own way. A familiar character in HOA stories, told with half a smile and half a sneer. But they did not know I had reviewed the neighborhood's elevation maps again the night before. They did not know I had remeasured the slope between the decorative berm the HOA installed last year and the natural creek bank. That berm looked beautiful in promotional photos, but it stood nearly 8 inches higher than the natural ground on the south side and nearly 5 inches lower on the north. A small difference. But water only needs a small difference to change direction. I crouched down to check the outlet of my French drain system. I cleared away dry leaves. The pipes were unobstructed. The wall stood there quietly, without any need for display. Winston stepped into his backyard, 2 houses down. He looked over at me, his expression uncertain. "Do you really think it will be that bad?" he asked. I looked at the current, then back at him. There was no mockery in his eyes now, only concern. "The soil is already saturated," I said slowly. "When heavy rain falls, the water has nowhere left to soak in. It will find the easiest path. And your wall? It only protects my side." He fell silent. I could see him calculating. His basement floor sits nearly 6 inches lower than mine. A small difference on paper. A big difference when water spills over. That night, I reopened an old email from a former colleague in the Army Corps. He once told me something I never forgot. Water always wins. You just decide where it goes. I made my decision long ago. Karen was different. I could picture her in her brightly lit living room, rereading my email response with irritation. She believed authority lived in the HOA seal, in warning letters, in votes. She believed order was maintained through uniform appearance. But water does not care about appearances. Around midnight, the wind began to rise. Leaves clattered against one another in urgent whispers. I stepped onto the porch, damp air clinging to my skin. A raindrop landed on my hand, then another. I did not panic. I observed. The rain intensified, shifting from scattered drops to a steady curtain. The sound on the roof changed from soft tapping to a heavy drumming, as if someone were pouring buckets of water onto metal. The creek behind the house changed its voice as well, from a gentle murmur to a low, rolling growl. I glanced at the clock. Close to midnight. I put on my jacket and stepped outside again. My flashlight beam cut across the waterline, now creeping above the edge of the grass. 2 inches, then 4 inches. I said nothing. I simply stood there and listened. In the distance, I saw lights flick on at Winston's house. His garage door lifted. A figure moved quickly inside. At another house, A door slammed shut. Karen was probably still telling herself this was just another heavy rain, like all the others, that her decorative berm would keep the water exactly where it belonged. But I knew the flow had changed last year, when they raised the ground to plant greener grass for the brochure, when they believed aesthetics could rewrite topography. I stood behind my wall, my hand resting against the cold stone surface. It was not a symbol of rebellion. It was the line between preparation and illusion. Thunder cracked, tearing across the sky. Rain fell harder still. Water does not negotiate. I took a deep breath and felt calm spread through me. Not because I wanted anyone to fail, but because I had done everything that needed to be done. They thought I was just a difficult old man in another HOA story. They did not understand that I had lived long enough to know that when nature decides to test human arrogance, the test always comes with an answer. And tonight, that answer was rising inch by inch. They did not wait for the rain to stop. They called an emergency meeting while the water was still rising. And for the first time, the laughter was gone from Karen's voice. The morning after the first wave of rain, the sky still hung heavy. The ground was soaked, the grass pressed flat as if it had just survived a silent battle. The creek had not overflowed its banks, but the water level was nearly 6 inches higher than usual. The current was muddy, swirling close to the edge of the HOA's decorative berm. The emergency meeting notice went out at 7 in the morning. The subject line was written in all caps. Emergency board session. I arrived on time. The community room smelled of dampness and stale coffee. No one talked about aesthetics today. No one mentioned community harmony. Karen sat at the head of the table, but her posture was no longer steady. Her hair was tied back in haste. Her face was tight with strain. "We need to discuss the drainage situation," she began, trying to keep her voice level. I sat at the far end of the table, silent. Belle placed a stack of photos on the table. Pictures taken that morning. Water nearly touching the back patios of 3 houses near the creek. One of them was Winston's. His basement window was only a few inches above the surface. "This has never happened before," Winston said, his voice low and tense. "2 years ago we had heavy rain too, but not like this." I looked up at the neighborhood map hanging on the wall. I knew exactly why. "The southern berm is blocking the natural flow," I said calmly. "The water is being pushed toward the center." Karen turned to me, her eyes sharpening. "Are you suggesting this is the HOA's fault?" That question was not meant to find an answer. It was a reflex, defensive and quick. "I am not suggesting," I replied. "I am analyzing." The air in the room tightened like a drawn wire. A few residents began whispering. They were no longer looking at me as a troublemaker. They were starting to look at me as a source of information. The plot twist did not arrive with a bang. It arrived in the shift of other people's eyes. Belle picked up the file from our previous meeting. She flipped back to my drainage study, the one she had skimmed with irritation before. Now she read each line carefully. "You predicted this?" she asked. I gave a small nod. "I predicted the possibility." Karen gripped her pen harder. "But your wall could be making it worse. It might be pushing the water elsewhere." I stood up and walked to the whiteboard. I drew a quick, simple diagram. Creek, berm, slope, my wall. "The wall is not pushing water away," I said, my strokes firm. "It only protects my portion." The flow was redirected when the berm was built. I turned back to them. "Who approved that berm?" Silence. One board member cleared his throat. "We did not request a county review because we thought it was just landscaping." Landscaping. I took a slow breath. Landscaping that alters elevation by more than 6 inches is no longer landscaping. It is a structural modification. Karen shot to her feet. "We are not on trial here." But most of the confidence had drained from her voice. She could feel what was happening. The balance of power in the room was shifting, inch by inch. Phones vibrated across the table. Messages from residents. Photos of water spilling over patios. Videos of garages taking on moisture. A woman at the end of the table began to cry. "My husband is trying to hold it back with sandbags." I looked around. I saw fear. This was no longer about an ugly wall. It was about consequences. "We should require Mr. Garrett to remove the wall immediately so the water has more space to escape," Karen said, almost desperate. I shook my head. "Removing the wall now will not help. It will only make my house the next weak point." The sentence landed in the room like a bare truth. I did not speak with anger. I spoke with the calm of someone who had seen this before. Winston looked at me, then at Karen. Maybe we should listen to him. That was the real turning point. The man who once laughed at the barbecue was now looking for guidance from the man they had mocked. Karen slowly sat back down. She realized she was losing control. But instead of admitting it, she tried to hold on to the shell of authority. "We will review our legal options," she said. I did not argue. I simply added one sentence, clear enough for everyone to hear. "The county approved my structure. And if they review that berm, things could become more complicated." More complicated. The words lingered in the air like another dark cloud. The meeting ended without a solution, but the balance had shifted. They were no longer in a position to judge. They were beginning to defend. As I stepped outside, the rain began again. Light at first, then heavier. I looked toward the creek. The water level was still inching upward, slow but certain. No one was laughing anymore, and for the first time, they understood this was not just another HOA story about aesthetics. This was a lesson in consequences, and that lesson had only just begun. That night, the rain did not fall. It pounded, and every udar was a warning no one on the HOA board could vote away. Around 11 at night, the wind shifted. The air turned thick, heavy as lead. I stood in the garage, checking the backup pump system one last time. Not because I was panicking, because I have always believed in preparation. My wife stood behind me, arms wrapped around herself. "Will it be bad?" she asked, her voice quiet but trembling. I looked into her eyes. "I do not make promises I am not certain of. I have done everything I can." That was not comfort. It was truth. The rain intensified. The sound on the roof changed from scattered tapping to a continuous roar, like a jet engine flying low overhead. I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The yard light cast a yellow glow over the rising water. The creek was no longer quiet. It twisted and surged, slamming against the southern berm. The soil began to give slightly along the outer edge. Water was searching for a path. It always does. My phone would not stop vibrating. Messages flooded the resident group. Water pooling near my patio. Basement window leaking. "Does anyone have extra sandbags?" The pace of that night accelerated. I grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the wall. The water level was already nearly 4 inches above the grass. I crouched down, studying the current. It pressed against the berm, then was forced sideways, redirected toward the central row of houses. A small design mistake. A large real-world consequence. At exactly midnight, Winston called. His voice was tight with urgency. "Water is coming through the basement window." I could hear the chaos behind him. Furniture scraping. A woman crying. "Stack sandbags along the north foundation," I said quickly. "Do not try to block everything. Guide the water toward the lowest exit point." I was not a board member. I held no title. But in that moment, people called me, not Karen. A plot twist does not need an announcement. It reveals itself in a crisis. A car sped past my house. I looked up. Karen. She stopped in front of Winston's place. Her headlights swept across my wall, lingering a second longer than usual. There was no laughter anymore. The rain kept pouring. Close to 1 in the morning, I heard a sharp crack from behind the houses. I ran outside. Part of the southern berm had slumped, forming a narrow breach. Through that opening, water surged harder, aimed directly at the 3 lowest homes in the neighborhood. My pulse quickened, but my mind stayed clear. If the berm failed completely, the flow would shift abruptly. The pressure would turn toward my house. I went back into the garage, dragged out 2 more sandbags, and placed them along the western corner of my wall, not because it was weak, because I understand what happens when water changes direction under pressure. My phone buzzed again. A message from Karen. "We need to talk. Now." I did not respond immediately. I looked through the rain-streaked glass. In the distance, lights flickered in several houses. A man stood in his yard, water up to his ankles, staring at the creek as if it had betrayed him. They had believed the berm would protect them. They had believed my wall was the disruption. But water takes no sides. At 1:15 in the morning, the water reached the top of what remained of the berm. Then it spilled over. Not violently, but enough. I watched as the flow met my wall, redirected to either side, sliding along the underground drain system I had installed. It did not enter my garage. It did not touch the doorstep. On the other side, a shout pierced the night. A garage door flew open. Water rushed in, reflecting the lights like shattered glass. I stood there, not triumphant, just quietly witnessing. Karen called again. This time I answered. "Your wall changed everything," she said, her voice strained and unsteady. I closed my eyes for a brief second. No, it only protected my side. Silence on the other end. Then a question, far smaller than the voice she usually used in meetings. "What do we do?" That was the full reversal. The woman who once ordered me to tear it down was now asking me what to do. I looked at the creek growling in the dark. We wait, and we hope the berm does not give way any further. I ended the call. The rain kept falling. The water kept rising. But inside me, there was no sense of victory. Only a quiet weight. They once thought this was just another HOA story about an old man defying the board. Tonight, they understood that knowledge does not need to be loud to carry power. And when nature tests a community, it does not care who holds the title of president. It only cares who prepared. At 3:17 in the morning, the pounding on my door began. There was no laughter left, no warning letters, only panic. I had not slept. I was sitting in the living room with the lights off, letting the faint blue glow from the yard spill across the floor. The rain was still coming down without pause, layers of water falling like a curtain drawn over all of Willow Creek. The knocking came again, harder this time, more urgent. I opened the door. Karen stood there. No neatly pressed dress from the barbecue. No wine glass. No mocking smile. Her hair was plastered to her forehead. Mud streaked her coat. Water dripped from the hem of her pants onto my doorstep. Behind her, the street was flooded nearly to ankle height. "Basements are flooding," she said, breathing fast. 3 houses, maybe more. I looked past her shoulder. At the far end of the row, a garage light flickered. A man was throwing water out with a bucket. A woman stood on her front steps holding a child, water swirling around her shoes. My heart did not race. There was only confirmation. The creek had surpassed the southern berm. The water was no longer being redirected in any controlled way. It was finding the shortest path to the lowest points. And the lowest points were not my house. Karen stepped onto the porch without waiting to be invited. For the first time, she did not issue an order. She asked a question. "Is there anything we can do?" The question hung between us like a confession. Power had shifted. Not by vote, by reality. I stepped out into the rain with her. It struck my face like small stones. I aimed my flashlight toward the berm. A large section had fully collapsed. Water poured through the gap like an animal that had been caged too long and finally broke free. I studied the flow, calculating quickly. If the rain continued at this intensity for another hour, the water level would rise at least 2 more inches. The lowest basements would take on even more. "We need to open an outlet on the east side," I said loudly over the rain. "We have to cut a temporary trench to redirect the water toward the vacant lot." Karen looked at me, her eyes blank. "We do not have equipment." "I do." The twist did not come with a boast. It came when I walked into my garage and rolled out the compact excavator I had kept from my final years before retirement. No one in the HOA knew I still had it. They thought I was just an old man with a pickup truck. They did not know I once led emergency flood response teams. We moved toward the eastern edge of the neighborhood. Winston and 2 other men were already there, water up to their calves. They looked at me the way people look at a way out. "We cut the trench here," I said, pointing to a low point near the wooden fence. "Fast. But it has to be angled correctly." There were no arguments, no motions, No resolutions, only action. The excavator roared in the night. Wet soil flew in heavy clumps. Every scoop was deliberate. I adjusted the angle of the trench by instinct and experience, calculating slope with my eyes. No blueprint, no board, just water and gravity. Karen stood a few steps back, silent. In her eyes, I saw the collision between ego and reality. She once believed authority lived in fine letters and penalty notices. Now, she saw it lived in understanding what was actually happening. 15 minutes later, the first trench was complete. Water began to shift direction, rushing toward the open lot. It was not perfect, but it was enough to relieve pressure from the 3 lowest houses. A collective exhale moved through the soaked men around me. But the climax was not over. A sharp cracking sound tore through the rain behind us. The remaining section of the southern berm gave way completely. A surge of water spilled forward, driving straight toward the center of the neighborhood. "Back," I shouted. We retreated. Water rolled across the street, slamming against Winston's exterior wall. But this time, because of the trench, the pressure began to spread out. The flow dispersed instead of concentrating on one point. I turned toward my own house. The wall stood firm. Water reached its outer edge, then slid to either side, guided along the underground drain system I had calculated long ago. There was no water in my garage. Only rain, heavy breathing, and truth. Karen stepped closer to me. The familiar pride was gone from her face. All that remained was exhaustion, and something that looked like regret. "I was wrong," she said quietly, nearly swallowed by the storm. I did not answer at once. I looked at the men standing in the water, rain mixing with sweat on their faces. I looked at Winston, who once laughed at the barbecue, now nodding at me with gratitude in his eyes. "No," I said finally, "you just did not ask." The rain began to ease as dawn approached. The water was still moving, but now it had somewhere to go. At 3:17 in the morning, they knocked on my door. At 4:30 in the morning, they understood. This was never a HOA story about an ugly wall. It was a story about preparation, about knowledge underestimated, about a quiet man who was never lacking in capability. And as the sun began to rise along the horizon, its light touched the cold concrete wall behind my house. It was no longer the object of their ridicule. It was the line between damage and safety, between ego and reality, between the illusion of control and the truth that, in the end, water always finds a way. And that night, only one house remained dry. That morning, 3 basements were flooded. My house was so dry you could clearly hear their wet shoes on my porch. The sun rose slowly, pale light falling over a willow creek that had just endured its longest night in years. The water had receded, but brown mud stains clung to the walls of several homes, marks that could not be denied. I stood behind my wall, my hand resting on the cold stone. Everything was intact. Not a single drop had crossed the top edge, not a single crack. Across the street, Winston was dragging soaked boxes out of his garage. His face looked gray from exhaustion and disappointment. His wife sat on the front steps, staring at the rolled-up carpet as if part of their memory had been washed away with it. Karen walked slowly toward me. No rush now, no commands. Each step seemed heavy, as if she were walking across the weight of her own ego. "We need to address this officially," she said, her voice hoarse after a night with almost no sleep. I did not answer right away. I looked toward the berm, partially collapsed. The soil was soft and torn, the edge of the grass ripped open like an exposed wound. "The county will have to inspect," I said calmly. Karen paused. That was not what she wanted to hear. "If the county gets involved," she said carefully, "they will review the entire neighborhood." "Yes," I replied. Silence stretched between us. In that silence, I could see the calculations behind her eyes. This was no longer about an ugly wall. This was about responsibility, liability, money. That afternoon, another emergency meeting was called. This time the room was fuller. Those who had once stayed quiet now showed up, their eyes no longer indifferent. Belle opened the discussion, her voice slightly unsteady. "We need to talk about the cause." The cause. I sat in the corner, and did not speak first. I let them talk. I listened to every excuse, every attempt to blame unprecedented rainfall. Then Winston stood up. It was not unprecedented. He said it could happen. The entire room turned toward me. A plot twist does not need drama. It only needs confirmation from someone who once doubted. Karen took a deep breath. "Mr. Garrett, would you like to share your assessment?" Her tone no longer carried authority. It carried willingness, or at least an effort to appear willing. I stood and walked to the whiteboard again. I redrew the diagram from the night before. Creek, berm, slope, flow. The berm was raised about 8 inches on the southern side, I said steadily. That created pressure toward the center during heavy rainfall. My wall did not cause the problem. It only kept my portion from being swept into it. A man in the back asked directly, "If you had not built the wall, what would have happened?" I looked at him. My house would have flooded with everyone else. No more. No less. Karen's hands tightened on the table. In her eyes, I saw the most uncomfortable realization for someone used to holding power. She was not just wrong, she was wrong in public. "We need to focus on solutions," she said, trying to regain control. "The solution is to hire an independent hydrologist," I replied, "and restore the berm to its natural elevation." Belle looked at me, her expression completely different from the barbecue night. No trace of contempt, only acknowledgement. "How long did you work in this field?" she asked. 30 years, I said. For the first time in that room, someone exhaled as if something finally made sense. I was not just a stubborn old man in another HOA story. I was someone who had spent a lifetime working with floods, with water pressure, with decisions made in the dark. Karen looked at me for a long moment. "Why did you not say that before?" I met her gaze. "You never asked." The answer was not sharp, not bitter. Just true. The meeting ended with a temporary decision. The HOA would suspend all demands to remove my wall. They would contact the county for consultation. As people filed out, Winston stopped beside me. "Thank you for last night." I nodded. "Next time, prepare before the water arrives." He gave a small smile, more weary than amused. I stepped outside. The creek had dropped a few more inches. The afternoon sunlight reflected on the surface as if nothing had happened. But inside this community, everything had changed. They once believed power lived in warning letters, in bylaw clauses, in votes. They had just learned that real power lives in knowledge and preparation. And sometimes, the person most underestimated is the only one who truly understands what is happening. The wall behind my house still stood there, quiet. No longer a symbol of rebellion, but a reminder that when you understand the laws of nature, you do not need to raise your voice to be heard. You only need to be right. 3 days after the flood, the county sent a notice of official inspection. And for the first time, the HOA board no longer controlled its own narrative. The pale yellow envelope was placed on the meeting table in a room that felt unusually quiet. No one joked. No one talked about aesthetics. There were no more phrases like community harmony or aesthetic consistency. There was only one cold line across the top. Floodplain and grading review. I sat in the corner as usual. Silent. Observing. Karen held the letter. Her hands did not tremble, but her eyes did. I could see it. A woman who was used to directing the course of events now had to wait for judgment from outside. The county would review the berm. The county would remeasure the elevation. The county would ask why the landscaping had altered the natural terrain without technical documentation. This was no longer a personal issue between me and the HOA. It was a matter of responsibility. Belle was the first to speak. "If they conclude the berm is the cause, we will have to redo the entire thing." "And the cost?" one board member asked. Silence. Winston sat in the back, his hands tightly clasped together. His basement was still being dried with industrial fans. Insurance might cover part of it, but the rest was time, exhaustion, memories damaged beyond repair. Karen looked toward me, not with the defiance she once carried, but with something closer to searching. "You said you would hire an independent hydrologist," she said. "Have you done it?" I nodded. "The report will be ready this afternoon." Several people in the room looked up. They had not realized I had acted that quickly. The twist was not that I was right. It was that I had prepared before they even realized they needed to. That afternoon, we gathered again. The hydrologist I hired was much younger than I was, but his eyes were sharp. He spread out maps, drone images taken after the storm, and the latest measurements. The southern berm has been raised an average of about 7 inches above its natural elevation, he said in a professional tone. This alters the flow direction during heavy rainfall. He pointed to my wall on the map. This structure complies with flood regulations. It does not increase risk to adjacent properties. Those words echoed like a final period at the end of every unspoken accusation that had come before. Karen sat upright. She understood what this meant. If the county agreed with this report, the HOA was not just technically wrong. They could face legal liability. One board member muttered, "We did not know the berm would cause this." I looked at him. Water does not need us to know. The air in the room felt heavy. No one mentioned tearing down my wall anymore. No more violation letters. No more 30-day deadlines. Instead, a different question emerged. What do we do now? Karen asked it, but she did not look at me right away. She looked down at her hands, then slowly raised her eyes. I answered calmly. Fix the berm. Lower it back to its natural elevation. Formally reconstruct the eastern outlet. And communicate transparently with the residents. Transparently, the words sounded unfamiliar in that room. Bell sighed. That will cost a lot of money. Less than a class action lawsuit, I said plainly. Several people swallowed hard. Winston stood up. If Mr. Garrett had not built that wall, we might not have realized the problem until it was worse. That was the moment I saw the shift completely. From troublemaker to early warning. From target of violation letters to provider of solutions. Karen looked at me longer than usual. Why did you not leave when we pressured you? I paused for a second, not to search for an answer, but to choose how to say it. Because I did not build that wall to win an argument, I said. I built it to protect my family. No one objected. The late afternoon light streamed through the meeting room windows, casting a glow on the wall behind us. I remembered the barbecue, the laughter, the sarcastic question. Ugly wall. Now that wall was no longer a punchline. It was evidence. Not evidence that I was right, but evidence that preparation always looks excessive until it becomes necessary. When the meeting ended, Karen did not walk out in front, as she usually did. She moved slowly at the back. As she passed me, she paused. I misjudged you, she said quietly. I looked at her. You only looked at the surface. Outside, the creek flowed gently as if it had never roared. The water reflected the blue sky, peaceful to the point of disbelief. But everyone in that room knew. Just a few more inches, and everything could have been different. And this time, they understood that real power does not lie in the title of president. It lies in the ability to see what others overlook. And I had seen it long before the rain ever began. Karen resigned before the county could officially release its final report. Not because of the water, because of the truth. The announcement was sent through the internal community email on a quiet afternoon. The subject line was brief. Board leadership update. There was no long explanation. No commanding tone like in her previous messages. Just a short paragraph. Karen stepping down effective immediately. I read that email in my study as the last light of day filtered through the window, casting the shadow of the wall behind my house across the floor. I did not feel victory. There was no sense of revenge satisfied. Only the feeling that a cycle had closed. The county had completed its inspection 2 days earlier. The report confirmed that the berm had altered the natural elevation by an average of about 7 inches, creating pressure toward the central area during heavy rainfall. They did not use the word negligence. They used the term improper grading. But in the world of insurance and attorneys, those two words carry enough weight. The special board meeting took place the following evening. Karen was no longer at the head of the table. Winston temporarily chaired the session. Bell sat quieter than usual. We need to approve a remediation plan immediately, Winston said, his voice no longer trembling like it had on the night of the flood. And we need to withdraw all removal demands regarding Mr. Garrett's structure. All eyes turned toward me. The final twist was not that I was right. It was that they acknowledged it publicly. One board member cleared his throat. We apologize for what happened. Apology. That word does not come easily to those accustomed to control. I nodded. I did not need them to lower themselves any further. The vote moved quickly. Unanimous. No more 4 out of 5. No more debate. Just agreement. They rescinded the violation letters. They entered into the record that my wall complied with all county regulations and did not violate the bylaws. For a brief moment, I remembered the barbecue. The sarcastic question. The laughter spreading through the scent of grilled meat. Ugly wall. Now no one mentioned that word anymore. Winston stood and turned toward the residents seated in the back. We need to rethink how we make decisions. Not everything that lacks uniformity is a threat. That statement was not only about the wall. It was about me. After the meeting, a few people approached. An older man who had laughed at the barbecue shook my hand. I thought you were overreacting, he said. I was wrong. I tightened my grip. We all learn. Outside, the creek flowed gently. The berm had been partially removed in preparation for restoring the proper elevation. Machinery worked during the day, engines replacing the roar of storm winds. Karen did not attend the meeting, but I saw her a few days later, standing alone near the roadside, no longer carrying the confident posture of a president, just another resident. She looked at me as I walked past. Her eyes were no longer defensive, nor proud. I thought control meant leadership, she said quietly. I stopped. Leadership is listening. She nodded. No argument. I continued walking, feeling the ground gradually drying beneath my feet. The smell of mud after the flood was fading, replaced by the scent of freshly cut grass. This community did not collapse because of the flood. It was simply exposed. Ego, haste, the belief that power lies in a title. I never wanted to be the hero in a HOA story. I did not seek the lead role in a Karen story where ego is punished. I only wanted my family to be safe. But sometimes, when you prepare in advance, you unintentionally become a mirror for others. A week later, the new berm was properly adjusted. The eastern drainage channel was formally constructed, complete with drawings, approvals, inspections. My wall still stood there. No longer a controversial obstruction. It had become part of the landscape. No one called it ugly anymore. And on quiet afternoons, when I sit in the backyard listening to the water flow, I understand one thing. Real power does not lie in forcing others to tear down what they have built. It lies in standing firm when the pressure rises. Karen once had the title. I had the experience. When the rain came, only one of those kept the water outside the door. And this time, the entire community saw the difference. 6 inches. Just 6 inches of water, and an entire system of belief collapsed. It sounds small. 6 inches is not enough to impress anyone in a meeting. Not enough to be printed in bold in an HOA newsletter. But 6 inches of water in a living room can destroy carpet, wood, memories, and the confidence of a community. I stood behind my house on a quiet afternoon, watching the creek flow gently as if it had never roared in the darkness that night. The surface reflected the pale blue sky, light shimmering like a false reassurance. But I know its nature. Water is not gentle. Water is patient. A light breeze moved across the wall behind my house. The wall that had once been called ugly. The wall that had been turned into a joke between the smell of grilled meat and the sound of clinking glasses. Now it stood there quietly, no longer needing to prove anything. Winston stepped over the fence, a cup of coffee in his hand. His basement had been repaired. New carpet. Fresh paint. Winston stepped over the fence. Winston stepped over the fence. But his eyes were different. You know, he said, watching the current. I used to think the HOA always knew what they were doing. I gave a faint smile. No one always knows. He nodded. But you did. I did not answer right away. I remembered that first barbecue. The sarcastic question. The dismissive looks. They saw a gray-haired man with a rough concrete wall. They did not see 30 years spent standing in mud, reading maps, listening to rising water in the middle of the night. The twist of this story is not that Karen resigned. Not that the berm was dismantled. Not that the violation letters were withdrawn. The real twist is what they realized. The person they underestimated the most was the only one prepared for what they feared the most. Karen moved away a few weeks later. No noise, no grand announcement, just quietly. Before she left, she knocked on my door one last time. "I thought power meant control," she said, her eyes no longer defensive. But that night, I could not control anything. I looked at her, no longer angry. "No one controls water." She nodded. Perhaps it was the first time we truly spoke as two human beings, not as president and resident. When she turned away, I did not feel like I had won. I only felt that a cycle had completed itself. My wall was still there. No one asked for it to be removed anymore. Some even asked me about the design, the permits, the drainage. This community did not change because of a vote. It changed because of 6 inches of water. 6 inches made them question. 6 inches made them listen. 6 inches made them understand that aesthetics cannot replace physics, and ego cannot replace experience. I sat down in a chair in the backyard, listening to the steady sound of water flowing. I thought about the men and women living in HOA communities, where sometimes reasonable voices are drowned out by rules and forms. Maybe you have sat in a meeting like that. Maybe you have been seen as the troublemaker simply because you asked a question. Maybe you have built your own ugly wall, literally or figuratively, to protect your family. If so, remember this. Preparation always looks excessive until it becomes exactly enough. And experience does not need to shout to have value. It only needs to stand firm when the pressure rises. If this story makes you reflect on decisions your HOA has made, or on a time you were underestimated but ultimately proved what you knew, I would like to hear from you. Share which state you are watching from. Tell me about your experience with your HOA. Have you ever seen ego nearly push an entire community into risk? And if you believe that knowledge and preparation matter more than titles and votes, leave a like. Subscribe so you do not miss other stories where patience and experience overcome arrogance. Because sometimes all it takes to change a community is 6 inches of water.